Welcome back to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast, my friends. I am so thrilled to finally say these words because we've been trying to make this thing happen for a hot minute, but here we are together. Listeners, you are in for a treat today. Welcome, Alica Forneret, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. And yes, finally,
We
feels
made
like
it.
finally. Yeah.
Yeah, we were celebrating off air, just, life be lifing, and that happens. So here we are today. I'm so grateful to have you on the show, and we are going to dive into your work, how you came to this work, your incredible organization, Paws, your nonprofit organization, what your mission is, what you're doing, what listeners might learn about, get involved with. But I'd love to start our conversation where I start every episode over the past 6 seasons, and that's just helping us unpack where each of our grief beliefs come from. And for many of us, we can trace a line back to an early loss that we faced and how the adults in our lives were modeling grief either explicitly or implicitly, and what you think that taught you about grief, and whether or not that serves you now in your adult life. But can you think of an early loss, and what did grief culture look like in your family around that?
Um, so I think the first time I was really confronted with processing grief personally, it
Yeah.
was when my mom died.
Okay.
My grandparents, I and it's interesting. I have like another answer to this, but
Yeah,
I
well,
think,
we have space for two, so you go for it.
yeah, my grandparents on my dad's side, my grandpa had died before I was born, and my grandma died, and we were like close enough as a family, but it wasn't how when I hear other people talk about their grandmother dying, where they're like it was like my mom. That's not what it was like for me.
Yes.
It was a different kind of relationship, and then when my grandfather died on my mom's side, we spent summers up in Canada and would knew them in a similar way, but it wasn't like a gut wrenching, heart wrenching, like this core person is being ripped from my life.
Yes.
I did not feel that until I think my mom died,
Yeah.
and that was in 2016. And I think my other answer to it, which is something I'm thinking about and talking about a lot right now, is I was adopted from birth, and I, have always known. I don't remember a time where I didn't know that I was adopted. My parents were very open about it. But lately, since becoming a mom, having my mom die, sort of going through all this mother related stuff in the last decade, it's really been very front of mind how that like loss of my birth mom and being removed from like her and that circle and that family is probably something that's been being processed and that I've been grieving for a very long time, but not having like fully tapped into it or understood it or connected to it in the way that I am now.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Oh, well, I appreciate both those answers, and you're bringing forward a couple of themes, some of which I've been wanting to explore more, and some of which I see over time. The first sort of, I would just name, for many people, their first loss is already in adulthood, and it's the person, a mother or a father figure, anyways, who might have taught you something about what grief, how you navigate grief. And so the sort of extraordinary difficulty of having to process that loss when that's the person you might go to for consolation on how to process a loss, I think is really profound. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my mom, we had a complicated relationship, but and there are a lot of things that I know I wouldn't have gone to her for.
Okay.
But if
Yeah.
my dad had died, I would have gone to my mom, right? And
Yes.
I know that there are those like sort of foundation shaking, world sort of rocking, turning upside down things that I would have leaned on my mom for. And she definitely, I think we're very similar and being very expressive and emotive, and probably if I look back at it, process a lot of things in very similar ways. And
Mm.
so I I believe I probably would see, if I really thought about it, how I processed her death, like reflected in things that she had sort of modeled for me in
Yeah.
terms of like processing other losses in my life leading up
Yeah.
to her dying. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. And even just to name that we can grieve even complicated relationships too, I
Oh
think,
yeah.
which we often though don't give ourselves and each other and other people credit for that because we're want to just immediately sort of write off, well, that was complicated, so there's no value in, or you don't have the right to. So I think that's an important thing to
Yeah.
remind all of us and to remind our listeners. If you're somebody who's grieving somebody you had a complicated relationship, for one thing, you are grieving maybe the resolution that you maybe hoped could come that would never come. So you're grieving,
That
or
would
the
never come.
loss of the relationship that you thought you had a right to have but didn't, right? So
Oh,
it's so many layers of losses. It's not just that loss of that person. Yeah.
absolutely. And I think about this a lot when my mom died. So she died in October. This weekend is the anniversary of her death.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I knew that was coming. I don't know why I didn't think about that in relation to like, maybe
Recording
this
this
was actually
conversation.
the time that we were meant to have this conversation and for me to
Yes.
spend a little bit of time thinking and talking about her. And that's why all of the things that pushed us here did, which is
Yeah.
kind of sweet. And I
Yeah. Can you share
appreciate
your mom's
that.
name again,
Yeah,
just so we can?
Deborah. Sorry. My
Deborah.
mom's name is Deborah.
Let's bring Deborah
Um,
into the room. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I've got a picture of her.
Yeah.
I think so. What I think about a lot is my mom died in October, and then I had my first Mother's Day the next year, and I hosted an event called Motherless Mother's Day. And what I really wanted folks to feel as I started like stepping into my grief work and writing and talking about grief and thinking about grief and hosting these events was that Mother's Day for me wasn't necessarily uh I just want to sob on the couch and I'm so sad and I miss my mom so much and this is so
Yeah.
hard. It was, oh, I'm annoyed at advertising. I'm angry that we never got to have conversations that I wish we had had.
Yeah.
That like I am not going to get to have brunch with my mom on Sunday, but also I probably wouldn't have gone home to celebrate Mother's Day with my mom anyway. And what does that say about me grieving this first Mother's
Yes.
Day? And when my husband and I ended up getting married, I had a very similar and sort of eye opening conversation with him where I felt really sad one day. And I was like, I wish that she was there to try on my dresses with me. And then he was like, would you really have invited your mom to do that? And I was like, actually, no. She probably would have been the last person she probably would have figured out how to get there and like would have made, gotten her way in. But I would have gone with friends if she was still alive. And that I think is something that I'm constantly processing, and it's been really huge. Just grieving my mom not being around when I had my son. That was a
Yeah.
huge transition, but I live in my hometown, 20 minutes from my parents' house, and I'm where my dad still lives. And I am very often, I'm like, I don't know if I would have wanted my mom in the room when I had him, even though sometimes I tell myself that I would have. But
Yeah.
yeah, so that complication feels very present for me consistently ever since my mom died.
Yeah. I so appreciate, Elisa, you naming that. First of all, just sort of vulnerably sharing that and naming that, because I think that's actually the case for so many more people than we ever talk about. My show included, but I think we often have conversations about the loves of our lives or the best mom and dad in the world or the best sibling. And we don't often enough talk about the complications of the relationships that had maybe soured or were contentious, or maybe just really what we're grieving is that they never got to be the way we maybe wished they would, or that they look like in the media or in the world. And that it's valid to still be grieving, but also just to be curious about, what are we grieving? Is it the
Yeah.
person? Is it the relationship that never came to pass? Is it the resolution of an argument that will never be able to be resolved? And just to name that so that there's less self-judgment or ambiguity about it, right? Just to hold that. Yeah.
And less comparison. I think
Yeah.
one of the hardest things for me has definitely been, well, I wish that I would have wanted to have my mom around for those things. Or I wish
Yeah.
that Mother's Day was sometimes, like, I've really thought, I'm like, I wish Mother's Day was just sobbing on the couch because I missed her so much. Or, but it's the, because I see other people experiencing
Yes.
that. But I think I'm living and moving in a way that is authentic to me, which is I feel what I'm going to feel. I
Yeah.
had the relationship that I had, and it wasn't all bad at all. Like,
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
relationship with my mom was not terrible, but it was complicated. And I I want to honor that, because I do think that ignoring that or comparing and wishing I had something else wouldn't be authentic to what I actually need to process and what I
Yes.
actually am feeling
Yeah.
inside.
No, I think that's so valid. And that sort of comparison that you're talking about, I call that grief thieving. Don't
Mm.
be a grief thief, which sometimes we're the worst. Sometimes other people steal our grief and, but often we do that to ourselves. And sometimes it's in the very situations that you find yourself in where we see other people maybe demonstrating their grief in ways that make us feel like there's something wrong about the way my inner experience of grief is, and then that's just unnecessary suffering. Look, grief is hard enough, everyone. We do not need to pile on the sort of the unnecessary suffering. So I appreciate you talking about, and I can imagine maybe it's a struggle sometimes, but always coming back around to the authentically, this is how I'm feeling. Like, you
Yeah.
might get tempted to wish it to be a different way or compare yourself to be another way, but you're coming back around always to, this is how it is. And the only way I metabolize my grief is by attending to how I actually feel, not how I think I should feel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
If it's okay with you, I wanted to come back around to the sort of second answer that you said, and
Yeah.
in particular because you were saying you've been thinking about it more and more. I imagine the grief around being adopted, especially as you've now had a child, and so that, which often happens. I've touched on it a little bit on the show. I've wanted to talk about it more. My mom is adopted, and my daughter is adopted, and my best friend is adopted. So I feel, and I used to work in adoption. That was my early work, foster care and adoption as a social worker. And I think it's part of what doesn't get named so often, really, on any end of the triad of adoption, which is the profound loss. Because so much culturally is like, yay, the child has a family and the
Yeah.
family has a child, whatever the circumstances were.
Yeah.
Um, and that there's not permission giving or space to be like, yes, yay, and I'm not with my culture. I'm not with my birth mom, my birth father, my birth, maybe siblings and community. And um, yeah, I think I just wanted to amplify that you said that and just open up to what have you been thinking about in terms of maybe the permission you did or didn't feel growing up in your adoptive family to express grief over your, birth family, and or just that it's just bubbling up now as you've become a mom, or
I think that's a lot of what has catalyzed a deeper look at my relationship to the grief related to being adopted. Growing up, my parents would have talked about it all day, every day. They were so open about it, very supportive about it. And I was aware of the, like, how it worked and why it happened. I don't think that I spent enough time or had enough space to process and reflect on the impact that that would have on me.
yes,
So I think the reality of it felt very comfortable and real, but the my relationship to that, like, transition and that gap in my life, and that is what I am now sort of tackling, where it's like, oh, I've known I was adopted my whole life, but what are these feelings surrounding it? Because this is a lot now. But I
yeah,
have different words, that I have different resources now that I'm working with a therapist who, um, like, specializes in working with adoptees and has done a lot of adoption and foster care work herself. Like, I think that having a different kind of conversation around it and
yeah,
how it sits in me is what's coming up. And so I know for me, when I had my son, one of the biggest things that really hit me and still makes me emotional. But I'm like, still, it's been 2.5 years,
I was
so
going to
it's
say
fair for
still.
that to happen. I'm like, it's not been that long. But he's the first person that I've ever met in my life that I'm related to, like blood related to.
Yeah.
And that was wild to me.
Right.
And the more that he looks like me and takes on a lot of my mannerisms, and I I know is going to be his own person and has a lot of his dad in him too, but it really shocked me what kind of an impact it would have to say, I've spent this much of my life
Not
completely
having that.
disconnected, not having that, right? Not
Yeah.
having that, not knowing that, not seeing myself reflected in someone else in that way. And um, that was huge. The other really big part of it is I have been, I think, really hit by and affected by the concept of giving a child away, for good reason, for whatever reason. I
Yeah.
know that I ended up with the parents that I was meant to end up with. I had a fantastic upbringing. Like, my parents took incredible care of me and my sister. Um, and when I had my son, I'll be frank, like, it
Yeah.
was a very hard year, and didn't it was just a lot of thinking about, wow, like, someone else did exactly what I did and then gave me to someone. And
Yeah.
it's been really wild thinking a lot about that, especially when I was really, really struggling in the beginning. That first year was super tough. And I just have really been thinking a lot about um, what it would have been like for her, what it would have been like for my parents, what it would have been like for me as a baby to, even though I didn't have words, I didn't have, a lot of the like conscious understanding of like, oh, how would that have worked now? I know that there would have been, especially as I've spent so much time with my son, and in those early days, just like, oh, I know being close to me
Yeah.
and being like held by me and touched by me and all of that would have deeply impacted him. And to not have had that from my birth mom, um, I'm really, really thinking a lot about how now I'm sort of probably unearthing and
Yeah.
grappling with and processing a lot of that.
Processing a lot of the loss that didn't
Yeah.
even come to the surface, it sounds like you're saying, or
Yeah.
you couldn't even, it was not present until,
Yeah.
and that happens so often. Our losses aren't present until they're sort of absent until something new
Yeah.
comes along, which is why grief is such a sneaky bitch, because so, it's not the only reason, but because new transitions, new losses, new gains, that's the tricky thing. Like, new
Yeah.
positive things that happen in our life can unearth the things that we, I often talk about the losses that we have. One of the categories of losses that are so missed, I would just say,
Mhm.
are the losses of the things we had a reason to expect that never came to pass. Right. So that might be like the lack of a nurturing relationship with a parent, or growing up in your
Yeah.
biological family, or a sense of safety in the world as a result of, trauma or some harm that came our way, or for those who face infertility, those losses are about what we didn't get. And for you, it sounds like, and I can imagine, and I've had this conversation with my grown daughter, with my best friend, with my mom as well, becoming a parent themselves. And particularly, as you said, seeing somebody who has your mannerisms, looks like you, has your eyes, maybe your skin tone, maybe your hair, pattern, is really where the absence becomes present. Your past
Yeah.
absence becomes present. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And it sounds
Mhm.
like you're working with somebody who's really helping you identify how to hold that and to metabolize that in a way that's different than processing the loss over your mother.
Oh, yeah, very different, but connected.
Yeah.
Um,
Say
I'm
more.
learning is it's I mean, 'cause, 'cause, I mean, 'cause, 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 'cause I like to use the word like death and died and
Yeah.
dying, but when I think a little more broadly, the concept of like losing my mom, I very much think that happened twice in my life. And I
Yeah.
am, I don't believe that I spent the first 2.5 decades really understanding what role that initial loss was going to play in my life.
Yeah.
And yeah, like you said, I don't, and I don't know what would have happened if I
Of
hadn't had a
course.
kid, but I don't believe that I would have seen that gap like you're talking about
Yes.
if I hadn't had a kid to like sort of take me back to, oh, that's what she
Yes.
would have gone through. And like it's also making me really stressed and thinking a lot about like with my mom, well, how old am I going to be when I die, and when I die and my son's going to have to process that. There's so much, right?
I know.
And
Yeah.
yeah, but it's very present in the last couple of years. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate again you naming that for us, of the many forms of grief or ways in which we experience loss in our lives that aren't talked about. I do think, as I said, the losses and the grief around adoption is so often, swept under the rug because we have this sort of toxic positivity, gratitude, savior BS story, and that we can't hold both things to be true, which is really what you just named today. Like, I was raised in a family that I loved, and even if you had a complicated relationship with your mom, with Deborah, you felt loved and you felt
Yes.
that that was a great place to live and to be cared for and to be nurtured. And not but, and this is a profound loss to have to come to grips with the fact that your birth mother made, I imagine, an incredibly difficult decision, but one that now that you just went through that process yourself really pushes on all of the wounds that is, Elisa as a little baby.
I think that's what people from conversations that I've had where I've tried to be, super real about my relationship with my mom and processing all of this is I I feel like it's more comfortable for folks to hear the but
Yes.
than the and.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot more comfortable to say, I had this tricky relationship, but everything's fine and I still really love her and this and that. And I
Yeah.
did it earlier in the call, right? But I think that what feels more real to and true to the complexity of our relationships as human beings and as children and parents and friends, all of this is I had a complicated relationship and
Yeah.
it was also very safe and caring, and it can be both. It really
Yes.
can be both.
Yeah. Thank you for drawing that out. Folks who've been listening to the show for a long time know and read my book, whatever. I mean, I literally have and tattooed on my body. And I think so much of the harm that we experience culturally, and we
Mm-hmm.
do this to ourselves, but also sort of in our conversations, just like what you modeled so beautifully right now, um, is that we struggle to sit with the ambiguity and the complexity of things, except that's where life happens. That's the intersection of life, is just pretty much an ambiguous, complex, situation. And the more we can learn to attend to it, I think that's where the growth is. That's where healing is. That's where actually connection is. Because
Mm-hmm.
when you admit that it's and instead of but, I can pause for a minute and think, oh, okay, then that validates my and situation in whatever
Yeah.
my relationship story is or my complexity is. So I appreciate that so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for walking us through that, and also for bringing Deborah into the room, but also helping us recognize that that was a first profound loss. And that was not that long ago. Did you say 2016?
Yeah, shit in
Yeah,
2016.
2016. So we're coming up probably on 8 years
Yeah.
this month. Can you take us back then to was it that loss that propelled you into thinking about the work that you've gone on to do as an educator, as a speaker, consultant around spaces of grief and grieving, and particularly for people of color, or did that predate your mom's death? Or tell us a little bit about the timeline there.
Yeah. So in 2015, I was working for a startup in New Orleans, and they went bankrupt. Surprise to me.
As startups do, but yes, go
As
ahead.
they
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
And I was told on like a Wednesday that I had to lay off my team by Friday, and then did that
Talk
and
about loss, by the
we
way.
but I'm here now, and I'm very grateful to be here rather than there.
Yeah.
So I was working with a designer at the time on the team, and we both had said, why don't we do something to keep our portfolios alive? Because my background is in journalism and creative writing, and I was running the content team there at the time. And so the designer and I said, why don't we do something to keep our portfolios alive while we look for new work?
Yeah.
And we decided to work on a print project together and a digital sort of content project together. And we were, I'm sure, as you are in New Orleans, sitting at a bar, and we had some conversation at some point. We said, okay, what topic do we want to do? And very arbitrarily chose death. We said, neither of us are like super interested in this, but it feels taboo and it feels weird and it feels cool. So
Yeah.
let's do this project about death. That was December 2015. We worked on that through all of 2016. And right as we were about to go to print with that project, that was when my mom went into the ICU and died in October. And then we went to print in November, and I started touring it around. I was over in the UK, had moved to the UK with my husband now, but was my boyfriend at the time. And yeah, so I had spent almost a year just
So
thinking about death,
bizarre.
talking about death, interviewing people, doing this really abstract, creative project around death. And then when my mom died, it became very clear to me that I was not prepared to handle my grief. And I was not prepared to talk about my personal relationship to these topics, because I was
Yes.
having a great time doing all this
Theoretical.
abstract, artistic, exactly stuff. But what kind of resources do I need? What kind of support do I need? What am I feeling right now? That at the time, a lot of the stuff that I was reading that pops to the top of Google was, like we talked about already, like, oh, your mom died. You must be sad. You must be crying all the time. And I was like, I'm mad. I'm mad. I'm confused. I'm jealous of other people
Yeah.
it was just
Yeah.
so confusing to me that what I was finding on the internet and in books did not relate to my experience in the beginning. So I started doing the work from there. And then it wasn't until 2020 that it became very clear to me through my own experiences, through experiences of like folks in the community doing death work with me, and like grief related work with me, that I was ready to transition into something different from just the grief work that I was doing. And that was when it became very clear that I was like, it's time for Paws to be born. And that's when I stepped into founding Paws and doing that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. I want to dive deep into what Pause is and
Yeah.
what your
Yeah.
dreams are for it. Um, I'm curious, you know, you name something like I was researching it and I was being a creative about it and I was being abstract, and then boom, grief happened, loss, death happened, and boy, was I not prepared. And I think
Yeah.
I try to say that to people all the time. I do think knowing more about the realities of grief can make it suck less. That was the name of my TED talk, because I really do believe part of why grief is so hard is, to your point about what you find on Google, is that it's not talked about honestly, and the anger and the complexity and the mood swings and the fog. I mean, now it is more. Now we're in 2024, but like when my husband died in 2011, it was like, you will move through the 5 stages of grief like a to-do list,
Yeah.
and voila. Um, and so I appreciate you naming that yes, it's important to talk about these things, especially the realities of what grief looks like, not the myth of what grief looks like. And that doesn't give you a free pass. You do not get to pass go. You do not get to collect $200. You still have to go straight through
Yeah.
the depths of it. Yeah. And so then you moved quickly from being sort of a creative, abstract person on the topic of death, grief, and loss to doing work. Was before you got to Paws, was that sort of one-on-one work? Was that death doula work? What did it look like? Still the creative
No.
part of you? Also, I'm just curious how creativity has been a resource for you or not in your own personal grief.
Yeah. So early on, so just for a little context, I guess
Yes.
like
Yes,
storytelling
please.
context too.
Yes, please.
So my sister got married at the end of September in 2016. My boyfriend, now husband, Daniel, I'll just call him Daniel. Daniel
Yeah.
moved over. Daniel. Daniel came over for my sister's wedding on the Saturday. And then we got on a plane Monday to move to Scotland together. And so my whole plan was like, I was going to take it to Scotland and we were going to print and I was going to shop it around there. And my partner was going to shop it around the US. So we got on the plane and I said bye to my parents. And that following weekend, my dad called and said, your mom's in the hospital and you need to come home. And I traveled a lot. I moved a lot. I was always bouncing around for my undergrad. And then after my undergrad, and my dad had always told, and my mom was sick often. And so my dad always said, like, when you need to come home, I will let you know that this is the time you need to come home. Otherwise, like, stay, she's in and out of the hospital, you'll be fine. And
Yeah.
he called me a couple days after we landed in Scotland and he said, this is the time you need to come home.
Okay.
So I came home. My mom died a couple days later. And for me at the time, I was still sort of in this whirlwind of like, I am in the middle of a project. I'm moving. I moved, but then came back with my
Right.
boyfriend. My mom died. I probably shouldn't leave my dad, but also I'm not supposed to be here right now. This is super confusing. So I stayed with my dad and then I went back and I just started doing little events and going to little pop-ups. And I went down to London and worked with a partner down there for a while, sort of shopping this print project around and getting it into stockists. And at the time, I was not working because
Yeah.
I moved and my mom died and I was living in Scotland and didn't know what I was doing. And so I just started writing, and with a background in writing and creative writing, it felt very, very natural. It felt
Yes.
very um, comforting. And for me, similar to you, like back then there wasn't a lot of what
No.
I was like yelling into the internet.
Ether. Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and now I feel like folks are way more real with this stuff than what I was able to find. But I figured I write, I like making art and doing creative things. I might as well stick with
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
And so I started writing. I published a couple more like print projects, and then I started public speaking, and then I started hosting events, and then I started um, doing HR consulting and doing a lot of work in the workplace with folks. So the creative piece, I think, dropped off when I started turning into a lot more of a business for me, when I was like, this is what I want to do. But I think that being able to write and write in a way that felt honest and creative to me definitely is the reason I'm here, because I think that's what was attracting folks to what I was doing originally. And I was hosting events where people were like, I've never spent a Mother's Day this way. I've never spent a Mother's Day
Yeah.
with other people who are like sad and angry, and they also want to take care of themselves and not just be sad about their mom. Like, I think there was a sort of space creating that I know I needed at the
Yeah.
time. And I was really happy to do that creatively for other people. So, yeah. And then it's completely changed now. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, appreciate you. I love the storytelling. I love storytelling, but I appreciate
Mhm.
you helping us understand context. And, two things you named there. One is you were already a creative person. And so it felt natural to you to use that skill set, practices, however you think about it, not just in that professional way of like, growing a piece of work, but also as a way I imagine for you to make sense of the swirl that was, swirling in your head, in your heart about this experience that you had. And I so often talk with people about, you know, people like, well, I don't know, I'm not a good writer. It's like, it's not about being a good writer. It's about finding whatever vehicle is for you to be able to take the swirl and set it outside yourself so that you can be in relationship with your grief. So you can look at, oh, what are the grief beliefs I'm holding on to that are actually causing me to suffer unnecessarily? And actually, you know, oh, I've not looked at this thing about my loss related to my adoption. It's just a way to get it outside of you so that you can then begin to work with it. If it comes out in the form of paintings or a creative writing project or a print magazine, great. But it's really about giving yourself permission to get it out. Did that feel true to you? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. It was a channel, and it was a channel for something that I didn't know how to even articulate myself at times, let alone with other people.
Yes.
So it was a channel for me to learn the language, for me to process the language, for me to have. I did a lot of interviews early on too with other
Yeah.
folks who were doing grief work, and
Yeah.
learning from them and finding language with them was very, like, truly lit me up,
Yes.
because it made me feel like you're saying something that I don't have the words for. And
Yes.
because you do this work, because you face it, because you are processing this in your own way, and at least giving me little nuggets of like, could this be
Yes.
something I relate to? Could this be something I relate to? That was so exciting for me to have that
Yes.
modeling, I think.
Yes. It's
Yeah.
so validating. I think one of
Oh,
the
yeah.
most painful, difficult, scary things I think about loss is you're having all these inner experiences, physiological experiences, emotional, cognitive, and it feels so isolating and you feel like you're the only one or it's wrong with me. And so whether it's the space that you created to be both sad and mad and think about yourself on Mother's Day, or it's the words or the, as you said, the phrases or the language, whatever we can do to put ourselves in the way of feeling seen and held and understood and validated in our grief is actually how we move forward and metabolize our grief. It's not about the forgetting or the gripping too tight. It's kind of the mirroring and the validating. Yeah.
And I appreciate what you said too. So I feel like that mirroring and validating felt really important, but it also, the one thing I will say is that I know how and when to stay in my lane. And I have met, so I always say this, and I say this to like our cohorts that come through, and anytime I do an interview, I'm like, I love grief yoga. I
Yeah.
think grief yoga is so incredible. I would love to do it probably every day if I could. I do not want to become a grief yoga teacher. I
Yes.
don't want to
Right.
teach it. I don't want to learn it. I don't want to facilitate it for folks. My purpose in this work, and my purpose, in Paws and everything that I've done, I think truly from the beginning is to make sure that if there is a grief yoga teacher who wants to get their name out there and spread their work, I'm an amplifier, a
Yes.
connector, a convener. And so for me, I think those early interviews and the early work that I did, even in 2015, kind of laid a foundation too for, this is how everyone else is doing it. These are the things that maybe can help me with my personal loss. And then it kept me on a path of, well, they're doing something that feels very authentic to them. I need to continue doing something that feels very
Yes.
authentic to me. And that doesn't mean doing everything or being everything for everyone or learning how to do, I don't want to do one-on-one therapy either. So
Yeah.
that's something that I'm like, I don't want to be a grief coach or counselor. But I love what they do. And I will make sure that they're present in my work through storytelling, through amplification, through connecting folks. And I feel like that's a really huge central piece of how I show up in the work. And I hope it's one of those things where, like, if anybody could say something about you, for me it would be that I stay in my lane and make sure that folks find what they need and truly accept that it doesn't have to be me. And a
Yeah.
lot of times it shouldn't be me.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I very much resonate. I know we've met
Mm.
before at a party, but we're just getting to know each other. But I very deeply much resonated with what you were saying, which is um, about being an amplifier. Thus, why I host this show, right? One of
Yeah.
the many ways in which I amplify. But and also, though, I think the reminder to us in our professional work, if you're listening, because I definitely have a lot of folks who work in the grief space who listen, but also this, I think, applies just to your life. It's like, it's so easy to be passionate about a topic or an area, especially one that comes from your own maybe pain or your own, the road that you've traveled, and then feel like when you look around seeing everybody doing everything that you have to be all the things for all the people and do all the things. And I certainly have, I've I've dabbled in that a little bit myself around my own curiosity, but I think the truest thing is that when we show up in our authentic self, doing whatever work or being whatever is intuitively authentic to us, that's where we make the biggest impact. So to your point, let other people do the thing that they do, but you're uniquely qualified given your insights, your lived experience, your talents, your personal story, the place that you've walked, to do what you're doing. So I think the more we can, and I do think sometimes profound losses help us get really clear about, like, what am I wasting my time on? Like, because I was chasing things. Not always, I'm not saying it doesn't, but it's an invitation. I do think a profound loss is at the very least an invitation to get really clear on your values, how you spend your time, who are you showing up with in the world. Sometimes we ignore that sign and we just keep trudging ahead on our little path. But and that's not a one and done, I would imagine. For me, I should speak for myself. I'm constantly having to remind myself of, like, whoa, come back into your lane. What is authentically inspiring you? And then follow that instead of getting lost in the.
Absolutely. I think for me too, I know and respect, I don't know what it is that I'm respecting. Maybe it's like the fluidity of life and where it takes you. It's like I was not 8 years old saying I want to run a nonprofit about death and racism in my 30s. That is my end goal. And I try to think too about and give myself like grace and flexibility. And I think too, like the endless option of I might not do this forever
Yeah,
either. I don't know what's going to happen when my dad dies or if something, I lost a friend or my husband or my child. Like, I don't know where this is going to push
right.
me. And I'm hyper aware of that and grateful to be doing what feels right to me right
Right now.
now. And like you said, like constantly like checking in. Is
Yeah,
this what I'm meant to be doing? And it's a resounding yes for me in this
that's
moment.
beautiful.
And if I wake up one day and then a couple more days and then a couple more days and the answer is like maybe, then no, then absolutely not. I'm so done with this. I tell myself like that has to be okay. And
Yes.
that can be a really good thing, especially when the work that we do is holding people and speaking to people
Yeah.
and modeling for folks and showing up for folks in a time that is probably incredibly challenging for
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
The folks that they're leaning on or listening to should feel deeply and
Inspired
authentically
and
connected to this work. Yeah.
100%. So appreciate you really laying that out for us and naming that. And I say the same joke all the time. Like, I was not an 8-year-old girl going like, I want to grow up and be a grief activist. That was like
Yeah.
not on my top 10 things that I wanted to do. Well,
Yeah.
so speaking of passion and what you're coming into,
Yeah.
what you were seeing in your lived experience and the work that you were doing in all of these spaces that you were talking about, interviewing people, hosting events, you started to feel very, and I'm also a co-founder of a nonprofit too, not also something I thought I would do, growing up, and now here
Never.
you are. And I've since stepped away from that. But speaking of passion, I just wanted you to start to tell us how Paws came to be, which, as you said, is really at the intersection of death and dying and racism and creating communities of support for people of color. Tell us about how Paws came to be. You can talk about what it's like to be an ED of a nonprofit, which, whew, I feel ya.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. It's a lot, but maybe
Yeah.
more around the calling or what propelled you for this mission, and what are you seeing as you bring this mission to life? Yeah.
Yeah. I was so for all those years that I was doing my other grief work,
Yeah.
up through 2020, I was also doing that on the side. I was doing that full time on the side of a full time job. So I was working in
Oh,
tech. It was, and then it got to be too much. And it was the summer of 2020. George Floyd was murdered. It was COVID. We were seeing inequities in how folks were being cared for and informed and taken care of and dying. And so I had been ready to step out of my tech job and ready both emotionally, physically, mentally. I knew, and my husband and I had agreed, like, it's time to go
yeah.
full time. And I'd already been full time, but to let go of the other
Yes.
thing, aka my day
One
job.
full time, not two
Yeah,
full
one
time.
full time, not two full time. So I stepped out of that role because it felt like in that moment there was an opportunity to really trust myself, trust the work that I'd been doing for those years, trust the folks that I had around me, and say, I think there's something that we can do a little differently,
Yes.
in terms of getting folks access to resources, the conversations that we're having in these spaces where we're talking about death and grief, and really amplify and highlight and honor the work of folks of color doing this work. Because one of the number one things that, the two top things I was hearing from folks were folks of color were, who are working in the end of life and grief space, were having a really hard time, fitting into and finding themselves comfortable building their businesses within traditional environments where they were trying to grow their work.
Yeah.
And then the other piece was, and I still hear it. Folks tell me, "Oh, well, if I'd known that I could have connected that person to a Black doula, then I would. Or if I'd known that I could have gotten them like a grief therapist that matched their race, then I would have. I just had no idea that there were any out there."
Gotcha.
So this sounds super aggressive, but
Nah.
it's still how I feel. I'm like, there is no excuse at this point. We
Yeah.
know there are folks out there doing this work. We know there are
Yes.
folks that hospitals, healthcare, mental health professionals, social work, everyone can be connecting these clients or patients or people,
Yeah.
human beings that they're working with,
Yes.
to that reflect their identity if the person is seeking that. There's no excuse, and
No.
what I was finding was that it was a lot of folks who just weren't looking hard enough,
Yes.
or doing the research, or caring to do it, or listening to people to understand, oh, I maybe might not be the right provider for them. I could make a referral, and they weren't doing that.
Yeah.
And so when we hit the summer of 2020, I left my day job. We started doing all of the business planning and governance setup for Paws, and we launched. I launched Paws in 2021, and our initial program was a business development residency, for folks of color working in the end of life and grief space, because I had seen it, I had felt it, being tokenized and brought into conferences
Black
or
History
panels.
Month or
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Was really at first great, and then super disappointing.
Yes.
And so I was hearing just from folks, like, what could it be like to have a space that we're developing our businesses and talking about this work that we're doing, but only with other people who get both the fact that we're folks of color side of it, and the side of it that's building a business is really hard and being an entrepreneur is really hard. And sitting over all of that, we're talking about a topic that so few people want to talk about. So when you end up in an incubator and you're like, and I'm a woman of color and I want to talk to y'all about death,
Death.
that is not a conversation. Yeah, right. Like,
Yeah.
I'm here. That is
Ta-da.
not well received in a lot of situations. So we ran that first program. Now that we're about to finish our third year, 2021, 2022, this will be the end of our full, like, the third full year,
Yes.
running the nonprofit. We have been running that business development program, we're launching a new community of practice for folks who work within institutions, to start advocating for these resources to be integrated into their institutions. And then we do a bunch of other stuff showing up for the public. We're doing a resource fair, where folks can come and connect live with the resources in Los Angeles. And really, for me, at the core of this work is I know what I wish I would have had when my mom died. And
Yes.
that's resources from folks who understood me and looked like me and had similar lived experience to me, and who could speak about my experience in a way that I didn't have to figure out how to make
To
that connection. We're
translate
sort of,
or
exactly, we could meet a couple steps into the conversation already. And so that's what I'm doing, and my incredible team and our board are doing at Paws is, for me, it's about hopefully connecting people to resources sooner than I was,
yes.
when I lost my mom.
Yeah. Talk about following your own authentic path and your own lived experience and putting something in the world that is uniquely only to you. And I think we all know this, whether it's from like, products on the shelf to social services to service delivery, is when it's designed or built by people who know the pain points, who walked that path, who have wished they had something different. It's always a better outcome because that person, and that feels to me like what you're saying is you experience that happening in terms of accessing resources, in terms of being a business person in the space, being a woman of color in this country, particularly as 2020 and continues to unfold, just the visibility of all of the underlying systemic racism and racism in this country. So to be building that, but not just building it for yourself. What I love about Pause as I continue to learn about it is back to that other action statement you said that identifies you before. It's just an amplification. You're saying, here's all the people who are doing this. No excuses.
No excuses.
Come, here is this central repository where I want to amplify them. I want to offer them even resources to be trained and supported. And I think that's so powerful. And just to name for you or just amplify what you just said is, look, walking in the wake of loss, death loss, or any other kind of loss is like walking through quicksand and mud and fog and forest. And I don't know what other metaphors I can use all at once. And so to the idea that you are removing some of the barriers for people to be to the place where they feel like they're shaking that off and that they're being held and met by not having to translate lived experiences or all those other things is just such a powerful gift. Now, you referenced a fair, which I know is
Oh
coming
yeah.
up. There's going to be, and the listeners know to the show, I'm having the honor myself of speaking at Endwell this year, which is happening in LA on the 22nd. But on the 23rd, tell us a little bit about Pause's fair and what people can know if you happen to live in the Los Angeles area, or if you're coming in for Endwell, or you just happen to be coming up to Los Angeles. Tell us a little bit about
Yeah.
this fair and what people can expect.
Yeah. So this is something that I've wanted to do since starting Pause. I think the internet is
Yeah,
a great thing. Zoom is
I know.
wonderful. To
No,
me,
in person
I'm
is
like,
all.
get in person. And so we're hosting a full day, and we're hosting it at our house in Los Angeles, a great grief support center, that I've worked with in the past. And so we're doing from 12 to 2, we're hosting open tabling of all folk. Everything that I mentioned is either run by or for, by and for people of color. So
Okay.
we're going to be having open tabling, where folks can come ask questions, meet new resources, have conversations with the providers themselves. And then we also are going to have over a dozen workshops where folks can come and have space held by people of color working in the grief and end of life space. Everything from move your body, care for yourself, process your grief, to the more practical side of planning for end of life.
Yes.
Then we're doing 2 panels in the afternoon, and then we'll be doing more workshops in the evening. And we also are doing a screening of Charlene Lamb's film Curating
Yes.
Grief. And then
Awesome.
Tita from Meso is going to be setting up a grief labyrinth that folks can walk themselves throughout the day. So for me, this is, I think, an embodiment of too, like how we show up to the
Yeah.
work. I want folks to be met with as wide a range and sometimes a little bit outside of the box sort of resources
Yes.
that might not be reflected when you just get a referral list from the hospital after someone dies or that your
Yeah.
therapist might know about. So, yeah, we're opening up this space for a full day for folks to come and connect with providers and really just be held
And
and educated and,
be
yeah,
in community with one another.
in
I agree
community.
with you. I
Yeah.
have been craving more and more, and I'm working to create more and more collaborations that are in person because while we can, for those of us who can, and I also want to name and recognize some people have,
Yeah.
limited immune systems and maybe this isn't available to you, but to be in person, especially when you're walking these paths, I think is so powerful. So I'm so excited to that pause that you're going to be able to offer this. And does it feel like maybe this is something that you hope to roll out and pop up throughout the year at other places? Or yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's a
This
dream.
is a pilot and a test of something that I hope will
Yeah,
become foundational to the work that we do. That's the
yeah,
plan.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, a little bit more, like if you could, dream what pause, like the spaces pause might be working in, whether it's rolling out one of these at a university institution or like, have you thought much about, just because I have listeners who are run institutions, who are therapists,
Yeah.
who are, do all kinds of work. That's how I've got hired for every, speaking gig and everything I've done.
Yeah.
So just wondering if folks are listening and they're thinking, yes, I want to be able to offer these kinds of resources or have this kind of education or have these sacred spaces to be held in whatever circle, because that's all we can influence, everybody listening.
Yeah.
It's the circles in which we navigate. So is there a kind of ideal place or space that
Yeah. So, in terms of the plans for the future, this is laying the groundwork essentially for us to ideally have a brick and mortar or mobile version of this one day. The
yes,
dream is a brick and mortar that we can expand. For folks who might want to bring it in, the other thing that we're, and I talked a little bit about this, the other thing that we're launching this fall is an on-demand product for HR leaders and managers to be able to talk about grief and death very differently in the workplace and to think
yes,
about how they update their bereavement responses and bereavement policies. And that is definitely like an easy in for
yes,
folks to
exactly.
be able to adopt this work in a place where they influence a lot of individuals. And I will say this, and anyone who knows me is like, she means it. My inbox is open, my mailbox is open. I want to meet anyone, particularly from institutions that are thinking about ways that they can integrate more resources, because the other big thing that we're doing right now and actually looking for an institutional partner on, we're having some conversation around this, but is a formal database of resources that are all folks of color and people, so that referrals can be more easily made within healthcare institutions or providers like therapists. So
Yeah,
therapists and mental health professionals. So we've already built the sort of V1 version of this database and are looking at building something a lot more formal with a partnership. So that again, for me, it's like, where do we touch the
I know.
public? And also, how do we make sure that the people who are serving those people within systems
Yep.
have the resources at their fingertips, and that database and building of that database and dissemination of that database is going to be really huge for us in the next couple of years.
Yeah. Oh, what a
Yeah.
gift Pause and you and the board and the team are giving. And I agree that we're always walking sort of like, how do we touch people's lives in that in-person, intimate place while also keeping an eye out to how can we improve systems
Yeah.
so that more people can be doing it. It's not just us one on one. And I walk those two spaces often, and they're very different experiences as the provider. I know, and you're putting on different parts of your
Wearing a lot of
brain and
hats.
hats. I can absolutely relate. I go into workplaces too, so I know I'm always like, which me? Although I think I still show up as metaphor rich, slightly sweary, goofy Lisa wherever I go. But to your point earlier, you gotta be
Be
you.
who
But
you are. Yeah.
yeah. Thank you so much for this beautiful conversation, for speaking so honestly and openly about the complexities of your own experience and also modeling for us in your storytelling the ways you can take your own pain points and find a way to be of service to others. And I imagine, I'm going to go out on a limb saying, and by doing that, also being of service to yourself and,
Absolutely.
healing the parts of you. So thank you, Alica, so much for joining me
Yeah.
today on Grief as a Sneaky Bitch.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for making the space for me today.
Yeah, thanks. All right, listeners, check the link in the show notes for more information about the event coming up in Los Angeles and emails and how to get hold of Alica so that you can bring the important work that she is doing into your systems and workplaces. See you next time.